the silent death and its forgotten origin. The 14th century was an era of unshakable faith, of kings and peasants, of growing cities and a trade network that connected the known world. Back then, the world was seen not as a complex, interconnected system, but as a series of distinct kingdoms, each with its own problems and glories. No one imagined that the same wind that brought the most exotic goods from the east would also bring the most terrible of plagues. The story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe, but thousands of miles away, in the frozen steppes of Central Asia. Bubonic plague, the disease behind the Black Death, is believed to have originated in a colony of marmots or other rodents in the Qinghai region of China or Central Asia. This bacterium, Yersinia pestis, lived silently in the fleas that fed on these rodents. Unless something disturbed its habitat, the disease would remain confined to that ecosystem, but something did. The expansion of the vast Mongol Empire, with its trade routes stretching from the China Sea to Eastern Europe, created the perfect path for disaster. Mongol armies didn't just bring war, they brought trade, and with it, a caravan of rodents and their fleas. Unlike European rodents, Asian rodents had developed a certain resistance to Yersinia pestis, but fleas hadn't. When a rodent died, the flea sought a new host, and who better to host than the humans themselves in the caravans and Mongol settlements? The plague, which was endemic in rodent populations, became an epidemic in a world on the move. The first wave of the plague broke out in China in the 1330s. Reports of devastating plagues in northern China and Mongolia, which decimated entire villages, were largely ignored in Europe. These were distant tales from an exotic and remote world. Europe had its own problems: endless wars, famines, and an overpopulation living in unsanitary conditions. Europe was ripe for catastrophe, but no one could have predicted the form it would take. The plague, following the Silk Road, spread like wildfire. It reached Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, and then, along the Caspian Sea, reached Crimea. It was in a Crimean port, Kaffa, that Europe had its first direct and brutal encounter with the plague. Kaffa was a colony of Genoese merchants and was under siege by the Mongol army of Johnny Beg. Legend, which may be both history and myth, tells that, seeing his troops dying in mass from a terrible disease, Johnny Beg had a cruel idea. He used catapults to hurl the infected bodies of his soldiers into the city, infecting his enemies. What followed was unimaginable horror. The Genoese merchants, terrified and infected, fled by sea. On board their ships, the fleas, now adapted to the rats that infested the decks, traveled with them. These ghost ships, with most of the crew dead or dying, arrived at the Italian ports of Genoa and Venice in late 1347. The locals were shocked by what they saw. The sailors were covered in dark, bloody swellings. Their skin was black in parts of their bodies, and they suffered from fevers and coughs. Death was swift and terrible. The ships were driven off, but it was too late. The evil had already landed. From the Italian ports, the plague spread. Italy, with its dense network of trading cities and a population living in close proximity, was the first to feel the brunt of the plague. Florence, one of the richest cities of the time, saw half its population decimated within months. The city's air, once vibrant with the sound of merchants and artisans, was filled with the screams of pain and the smell of death. The plague traveled by land and sea, spreading at a terrifying speed for a time without trains or cars. France, Spain, England, Germany, no kingdom was safe. Europe, unknowingly, was about to enter its longest and darkest night. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a cataclysm, and the world as they knew it was about to misunderstanding of horror. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe was like a meteor falling from the sky, but in slow motion. At first, no one understood. The science of the time was tied to the theory of the four humors, and it was believed that the disease was caused by an imbalance in the body, or by bad air, or miasma. They had no idea what bacteria were or how fleas and rats could be vectors of disease. They had no idea that the very air they breathed, the very water they drank, and even the very dust in their homes could carry death. People who fell ill displayed terrible, visible symptoms. First came high fevers and chills, then coughing up blood. But the most striking feature of the bubonic plague were the buboes, large, black, painful swellings that appeared in the armpits, groin, and neck, hence the name of the disease, Black Death, or Black Death. These buboes indicated that death was on its way and inevitable. Despair gripped the cities. Municipal authorities tried everything. They ordered the burning of incense and herbs, believing the aroma would purify the air. People carried sachets of fragrant herbs, trying to protect themselves. They tried to isolate the sick, but it was too late. The disease spread with lethal speed. A father would wake to find his son dead in bed. A wife would go to the market and return to find her husband unconscious. The dead were piling up at an alarming rate. Social chaos was total. Fear led to abandonment. Children abandoned their sick parents. Wives fled their husbands. Doctors refused to treat the sick, and priests refused to perform last rites. The promise of eternal salvation no longer seemed so appealing when the risk of death was imminent. Cemeteries filled up within days, and bodies had to be piled into mass graves. Hundreds and, in some cities, thousands. Amidst this horror, people searched for someone to blame. Fear and ignorance led to one of the saddest pages in history: the persecution and massacre of Jews throughout Europe. The Jewish community, which often lived in isolated neighborhoods, was accused of poisoning the wells or of being the cause of the plague. The Jews, who had better hygiene conditions and, therefore, fewer rats and diseases in their ghettos, were unjustly accused. They were seen as scapegoats for the rage and despair of a panicked population. Entire cities, such as Strasbourg, saw their Jewish communities brutally massacred, with people being burned alive. Another bizarre phenomenon that emerged during the plague was the flagellant movement. Thousands of people, believing the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, formed processions. They walked from town to town, clad in hoods and naked from the waist up, whipping themselves with leather straps until blood ran down their spines. They believed that by self-flagellation they could atone for the sins of all humanity and appease the wrath of God. While initially viewed with reverence, they quickly became a social menace, further spreading the disease and preaching anarchy. The Black Death was not just a physical illness, but a crisis of faith and social order. In just a few years, it killed between 75 and 200 million people, reducing Europe's population by up to 60%. Entire cities were reduced to villages, farmland was abandoned, and the structure of feudal society, which had governed for centuries, was on the verge of collapse. The air was thick with death and uncertainty, and Europe, which had once felt itself to be at the center of the world, realized it was as vulnerable as anywhere else. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire era. Feudal society, with its rigid hierarchy of lords and serfs, was one of the first systems to crumble under the weight of the disease, with a huge percentage of the peasant and working population dead. The survivors found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. Before the plague, labor was abundant. Peasants were serfs tied to their lord's land, with nowhere to go. But after the plague, the situation reversed. Now there was more land than people to cultivate it. Labor became a scarce and valuable commodity. Peasants who could previously be forced to work for little or nothing could now demand higher wages and better living conditions. The demand for labor was so high that feudal lords were forced to compete with each other for workers, offering land and freedoms that were previously unthinkable. This new reality dealt a fatal blow to the feudal system. The Black Death, unknowingly, was acting as a revolutionary agent, breaking the chains of serfdom and empowering the poorest. Rulers tried to resist this change. The English government, for example, issued a statute of laborers to try to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But it was futile. The economy, driven by the force of supply and demand, had changed forever. Peasants could simply flee and find better working conditions in other lands. The Black Death also changed the way people thought about religion. To many, the plague seemed like proof that God had abandoned humanity. After all, why would a loving God allow such a catastrophe? The clergy, who promised salvation and healing, often died as quickly as the faithful. The image of priests fleeing the beds of the dying shook confidence in the Catholic Church, which had been the backbone of medieval society. While faith did not disappear, it became more personal and less dependent on institutions. Death, once a taboo subject, became a constant and visible presence. The art and literature of the time were profoundly impacted. The theme of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became popular. It was an artistic representation of skeletons or death itself, leading people of all social classes, kings and peasants, cardinals and merchants, to the grave. The message was clear. Death did not discriminate. It was the great leveler. All rich and poor were within its domain. The Black Death also had an unexpected effect on education and science. With the deaths of many intellectuals and religious figures, universities were forced to open themselves up to new talent. The need for new doctors, priests, and teachers led to the loosening of social restrictions. Education became more accessible to those not born into nobility. This planted the seeds for a new way of thinking, which would later blossom in the Renaissance. The Europe that emerged from the Black Death was a different place. It was no longer the same rigid, hierarchical society. It was a more fluid, more questioning society, and, ironically, one with a future of new possibilities, even though the cost of getting there was the lives of millions. The Black Death did not disappear all at once. It became endemic in Europe, returning in less virulent waves for centuries. Small outbreaks became a part of life, but the plague never again caused the devastation on a continental scale it did between 1347 and 1351. The reasons for this decrease in virulence are still debated, but it is believed that improved hygiene, the construction of cities with more space between houses, and the immunity developed by the surviving population were crucial factors. The legacy of the Black Death is complex and far-reaching. The plague marked the end of the Middle Ages. It catalyzed social and economic changes that were already underway but accelerated brutally. The breakdown of feudalism led to the emergence of a new class of landowners and, eventually, the rise of a middle class. New freedoms and social mobility generated a new energy in Europe, an energy that would fuel the Renaissance. The age of navigation and the age of exploration. The fear of epidemics never disappeared. The Black Death gave us the concept of quarantine. The word quarantine comes from quaranta giorni, or 40 days in Italian, the time Venetian ships were forced to wait in port before unloading, hoping the disease wouldn't break out. The plague taught us, in the harshest way possible, that disease respects no borders, no wealth, no status. In our modern era, the Black Death remains a grim but relevant lesson. The COVID-19 pandemic, though unparalleled in terms of lethality, has shown us how fragile our global societies can be. It showed how fear can lead to irrational acts, how misinformation can spread as quickly as a virus, and how isolation can be a cruel but necessary tool. The story of the Black Death is not just a tale of medieval horror. It is a reminder that, even in the face of the greatest darkness and despair, humanity is capable of resilience and adaptation. It is proof that the world can change forever in the blink of an eye, and that history, no matter how much we try to forget it, always catches up with us. If you've made it this far, it's because the history of humanity, in all its complexities and horrors, fascinates you. If your channel seeks to tell these stories in a profound and engaging way, subscribe so you don't miss a video. Leave a like and comment below which historical fact you'd like to see in our next video. And of course, share this story so more people can learn about this forgotten chapter of our past.